thanks again for coming.
So typically our thesis advisors introduce us, and because Pratt's not here today, we kind of pulled things together and decided to introduce each other. Heidy's an artist. She always has been, and it'll be evident from her first slide. She's also spent the last 9 months getting intimately acquainted with the shop pot here at Pratt, which is a feat. So I'd like to introduce her. She's a designer at the artistic and technological frontier.
Hi, thank you all for being here. My thesis is entitled The Art of Design. For me, the thesis began when trying to find my place as a child, as a child trying to find my place as a designer. When I was a child, my parents defined me as an artist, and it was a title that I proudly wore. I never pursued the field of fine art, but that need to find self-expression in whatever type of work I was doing has never gone away. So when starting this process, I wondered whether it really had to be one or the other, and why. And then I posed some questions. So what is the difference between art and design? Is a designer an artist? And can design products be considered works of art? I then had the opportunity to interview some respected designers and artists across a variety of fields, and these are some of the answers that I got. Oh, it's not. Apparently they had nothing to say.
We just did it. We just did
Of creating objects that are artistic and art-like can exist within the framework of both commerce and design.
For me, one of the most interesting things in what we do is exactly the boundaries.
For me, it's seamless. There isn't a huge difference.
You know, the design work that I do is art. The problem that the visual answer is created for is coming from a different place.
Artist almost feels a little too lofty for me at this stage.
With art, it can be pure inspiration. It does not necessarily have to have the functional regard for the end user.
An artist, as a designer, has to have a practical point of view.
I think design is a little bit more specific.
Whether a curator has invited me to be a part of an exhibition or whether I'm applying to be a part of an exhibition.
If you look at art, it's like its function is to be beautiful and kind of stimulate emotion. That is its function.
It's a considerable amount of work on my end before I even know if I'm going to be accepted into a show.
A fine artist is not bound by any restrictions.
It's 50% the work that you make and 50% the marketing of it.
And I try not to like put a title on it anymore. The line is so blurred between the two.
I really only had one objective, which was to really do good work. And I never worried about anything else. And I was lucky.
So as you can see, I got quite a mix of responses. And what I found was that the most important thing when talking about the subject was not the how or the what, but the why of the question. Why do cultures make art? Why do we become designers? Why do we create at all, and why is it important? In these conversations, every designer talked about their desire to create and work with their hands as a major catalyst in choosing their career, which led me to think about self-expression and how important it is to people. Our self-expression allows us to communicate and to contribute to the world, and every member of society paints an overall image of who we are. A look at history will tell us that humans have been creating objects of functional beauty and art for centuries. The beauty of these objects is that they're infused with deep cultural history and symbolism. Even much later movements like Rococo and Art Nouveau depended on tradition and craftsmanship to create objects that inhabited both the art and the design world. However, as most of us know, with industrialization, these philosophies for creating came largely to an end. With mass production came the ease of manufacturing, but also a disregard for the human touch. Today, however, we live in a world where technology makes things possible, but it doesn't necessarily have to replace our hands. So in beginning the practical part of my thesis, I started by considering my own creative impulses and my love of pattern and color. And these are pieces that I created both here at Pratt and in my professional life. And when making these, I wasn't setting out to use pattern and color per se, but in going back and looking at my work, I found that it always contained those elements. So I decided to push that a little further. I also thought about having entered into this new world of industrial design, how that has made me sensitive to the objects in our world and their power to tell a story. I think technology is very emblematic of the transient nature of products and helps to create a narrative about time. We see tapes and we know what happened at the end of the last century. We see an iPad and we know what happened within this past decade. However, there will come a time in the near future when lots of these words will lose meaning to new generations. I then looked to African textiles, which provided a lot of inspiration for me. African textiles and weaving are an important part of the culture. They're used not only for clothing and soft goods, but they also carry a lot of symbolism and tradition. Patterns and textiles were once a way of identifying members of a tribe and spotting outsiders, and I find these pieces to be beautiful works of art. With those ideas in mind, I began creating patterns using images of obsolete technology. Creating these pieces gave me the opportunity to catalog these fleeting objects and also to explore color, pattern, and proportion. So I created hand drawings and then used Photoshop to manipulate the images. My goal was to engage the viewer through pattern and color, and only after further investigation for them to discover what the components of the pattern actually were. I found that the patterns that were most recognizable without being too obvious elicited the greatest amount of delight from viewers. In moving forward, I decided to create a book to display the textiles in order to show them to a future buyer. I also printed the 4 most popular patterns and colors on linen cotton canvas, and then I pulled them over stretchers to display in the same format that you would a painting. I think displaying them in this format leaves them a little open to interpretation and allows the viewer to decide what he or she would do with them. Moving forward from this project, I looked at current technology and how I could juxtapose it with more traditional products or methods. I decided to further develop a project I worked on in the spring of last semester that introduced me to the combination of rhino-cam and craft, and I chose to work with crochet. Rhino-cam is a plug-in that allows a manufacturer to prep a part for CNC milling, which is what you just saw happening there. And crochet is one of the few crafts that cannot be replicated by a machine. Queen Victoria used to have, or Queen Elizabeth, sorry, had dresses made of crochet lace by nuns. And they exercised this craft as a form of meditation because they could do it while praying or singing and praising. Also, in 1845, during the Great Famine in Ireland, it was the crochet cottage industry that helped them to survive this famine. This is a great craft that gets passed down from generation to generation, and today it can be used as a great form of creative self-expression in fashion, in home goods, in art, and most recently in science, where it's been used to describe a hyperbolic curve. So in starting the project, I began by digitizing crochet stitches, and I did this by creating paths in Rhino that followed the same trajectory as a piece of yarn would during a crochet stitch. And then I used those paths to create patterns based in traditional crochet. I then created some digital manipulations of the patterns and build them out using these virtual tools in rhino-cam. I created several different patterns and textures virtually until I found some that I felt were visually engaging and also shared a direct relationship with crochet. And then I milled those out of blue foam. The process of carving these patterns to discover way they beneath and the visual results kind of reminded me of fossils. I also saw a direct correlation between the cataloging of history through fossil excavation and the cataloging of history through this process of preserving and renewing the craft of crochet. So with that in mind, I decided to try casting some of the pieces in plaster and making some clay imprints as well. So this was my first experimentation into plaster casting, and I actually had a problem with the mold and ended up having to literally dig the piece out like a fossil. So that was a very direct correlation. I also had a pretty limited success with with pressing clay into the mold. Although I did get a really nice relief, it was very heavy and hard to control, and it ultimately just turned into this mass of clay pattern. I then shared my mill pieces with other designers and artists and got some great feedback. And one of the most, one of the responses that I took to was